Gentlemen, on this episode of Bureau Files, we're going over how I would properly defend Minas Tirith in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. Boys, I'm cooking. Minas Tirith defense under Bureau Files command, gonna go way better. Now, before we really get into the video, I will say that I have seen many of your comments requesting that I go over the Battle of Minas Tirith. And at first, I wasn't necessarily inclined to do so because really, I was more a Helm's Deep guy. I think I still am a Helm's Deep guy. I just love the Battle of Helm's Deep, the soundtrack, the archery, the Uruk-hai. Probably one of my top favorite fictional battles ever. I was on the fence about this, and when I started kind of like dabbling about it, researching it more, seeing the contrast from, the book versus the movie, I actually got kind of into it. I'm really excited to go over it, so without further ado, let us engage. Now, for this video, to keep things more streamlined and simplistic, I am going strictly based off what I could see in Peter Jackson's depiction of the battle and defense in Pelennor Fields of Minas Tirith, not necessarily Tolkien's work. In the book, it's actually a much more well thought out battle than what was depicted in the movie. I grew up watching the movies first, and they are what I know a lot better. I have still yet to thoroughly read the Lord of the Rings trilogy, so part of the blame is on me, fellas. I'm sorry. This video isn't necessarily to bash on Peter Jackson's work and say that it is bad. It is more so to highlight things that could have been done better in his movie world to give the defenders of Minas Tirith a much better shot at holding out against the armies of Mordor. It's also just like a fun thing because the more you learn about that era of fighting, that being, ancient to medieval era of combat, you kind of realize how movies depict things is very inaccurate to how it probably would have happened. But to be fair, how it realistically would have happened would probably be a lot more boring, tedious, and arduous for the compressed film medium that is a movie. So some of this stuff does make sense, but alas, we will dive on in. Spoiler, this video is going to talk about trenches. Who would have thought? I'm going to stop you right there, Chief. I know you want to defend Minas Tirith, but I got to make some money. Fighting the orcs of Lord of the Rings is a challenge. A bigger challenge is not looking cool while doing it. And that's why we gotta thank this video sponsor, Americana Pipe Dream Apparel. Knowing the demographics of this channel, I know you'll like this sponsor. Though I doubt they have the items like Mithril of Middle-earth. They have a whole slew of other items of military surplus to fill out your inventory. Their bread and butter being military surplus from many of the nations around the world. I've been shopping at and using Americana Pipe Dream Apparel for years now. Not only do they have military surplus clothing, but they have night vision, knives, manuals, e-bikes, Japanese pocket knives. Everything a nerd such as yourself would find cool and awesome and be excited to show his pals. Sure, they may not have cool swords, but their Japanese pocket knives will not only make you feel like the weeb that you are on the inside, but the samurai that you can be on the outside. It's actually a pretty sick little pocket knife. Exquisite. If you use code BIGBFILE at checkout, you'll get a 10% discount. I call that a screaming deal. A screaming deal so loud, it's even more of a screaming deal than what the Nazgul could screech up. So big thank you to Americana Pipe Dream Apparel for sponsoring this episode. Now, Minas Tirith itself is a beast of a city. But before we can get there, let's quickly recap from the last video that we did. Lord of the Rings, the one ring to rule them all. Nerds. It's okay, I'm one of you. In an earlier video on this channel, we talked about how I'd properly defend Helm's Deep. And to be clear yet again, I thoroughly love these battle sequences. They get the blood flowing. From a tactical standpoint though, there are things in general that can be done better. I enjoy the battle for Helm's Deep more than I enjoyed the battle for Minas Tirith. Like I'm thinking in like a total war game unit terms where it's like you have the best archers of Middle-earth fighting some of the best heavy infantry attacking. That'd be the Uruk-hai of Isengard going up against Théoden, his fortress at Helm's Deep, and then these archers are there to help tip the scales, but the battle looks pretty much lost until, of course, the Rohirrim show up. Same thing with the battle for Minas Tirith. It's almost like a similar thing where it's like, battle looks lost, the Rohirrim show up. Surprise, But in that sense, it's more like the meta heavy infantry for mankind, that being the soldiers of Gondor being there, as opposed to maybe the orcs and uruks of Mordor. I personally do not think the orcs and uruks of Mordor are as cool as the Uruk-hai of Isengard. The aesthetic of the Uruk-hai of Isengard are, as far as orcs go, S tier. Their armor, their build, their weaponry, just aggressively brutish. It looks more well put together than the armor of the orcs and uruks of Mordor. They're not as like scary looking, they're not as well built as the Uruk-hai of Isengard. I realize I went on a tangent there, but I was excited to talk about this to you boys. Hey fellas, you want to give your lady some birth control to start talking about the orc aesthetics in Lord of the Rings? Okay, so to speed run the backstory, the army of Isengard, which was meant to be like another force to envelop Middle Earth, is defeated at the Battle of Helm's Deep. The Rohirrim are now freed up, and they are on the move to go help out and relieve Gondor. Now, Gondor at this point seems to be kind of fighting for its life under a lot of pressure from the forces of Mordor. It has these river pirates terrorizing its other cities in Gondor, so it's tying up troops. There are troops in Ithilien, say like Faomir's Rangers doing ambushes, and then of course there's also troops in Osgiliath. The idea is that Gondor is kind of stretched thin, and Mordor is gearing up for one big push to get in there. The armies of Isengard and then the other armies coming in were there to also disrupt and totally envelop the world of men. Now, specifically to hyper-focus down, we're going over yet again Peter Jackson's depiction of Minas Tirith. We got to know what we're working with and lay some groundwork for the armies at hand. I will say that I am getting some mixed numbers from things that I research or type in about the size of armies that we have for numbers to work with in this instance. Say, for example, when I research the garrison for Minas Tirith, it gives me anywhere from like 6,000 Gondorian soldiers to anywhere to 10,000 Gondorian soldiers. And then on the other side with the orc army, it's like anywhere from 30,000 soldiers all the way up to 200,000 soldiers. That's a massive leap to work with, and it seems like from what you see in the movie with that massive orc formation out there, it's a rather large, sizable force, and it could very well be into the hundreds of thousands. But for the sake of the video, we kind of got to narrow it down. For instance, one source is 10,000 Gondorians versus 200,000 orcs, and that source would be Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings wiki is giving me that number. That's a tough battle, fellas. 10,000 versus 200,000. Oof, that's a 20-to-1, man. Oh, Colton, not looking so good, dude. Can you kill 20 orcs yourself?
20 orcs or 100 gorillas? Or wait, what was the thing?
20 orcs all day. I could kill 20 orcs. Orcs aren't that scary. Orcs are like manlets. I'm not scared of the orcs. The orcish behavior shall not break my resolve. Okay, so if this is the case, if we're going 10,000 against 200,000, this really does a lot of damage to the potential of a good defense, because if we were going with, say, the 6,000 versus 30,000, that's not as crazy of a defense, 5-to-1 as opposed to 20-to-1. Okay, so since it's on the Peter Jackson wiki, I think against my better desires for a more realistic chance of survival, we'll still go with that because it is still rather interesting. So 10,000 Gondorian troops available to us versus 200,000 orcs coming up against Minas Tirith. One thing I was curious about was the breakdown of the style of units, thinking yet again if this was like a total war match. So one thing I did was ask ChatGPT to give me a breakdown of the numbers of the different style of units. Gondor, 10,000 troops. Defenders. Gondor Spearmen, 2,500. Core Infantry Line. Shield Wall, excellent versus cavalry. Gondor Swordsmen, 2,000. Versatile melee unit, heavily armored but lacks mobility. The Rangers of Ithilien, 800. Elite skirmishers, long range, can harass siege crews and officers. Gondor Archers, 1,200. Standard archers with limited armor, hold city walls and kill lanes. Citadel Guard, the elite bodyguards, defend inner gate and key tiers, high morale. Trebuchet crews, 100. 5 to 6 stone throwers, anti-siege weaponry, morale force multipliers. Militia levies, 1,500. Light infantry and volunteers, low morale but used as city reserves. Cavalry knights, 300. Imrail's Swan Knights, shock cavalry, only mobile reaction force. And then there's 100 engineer sappers, maintain wall integrity, repair gates, deploy fire traps. If we have fire traps, which I'm all down for. We'll get there. Mordor, 200,000 troops, attackers. Snaggle Orc Rabble, 80,000. Light infantry trash units, used to absorb arrows and overrun walls. Mordor Orc Infantry, 50,000. Mainline Orc soldiers, better armor, push siege towers and ladders. Uruk-hai of Mordor, 15,000. Sauron bred heavy infantry, better discipline, siege breach specialists. 10,000 orc archers, 500 trolls, 100 siege trolls with armor. These are the elite trolls, armored in iron, push Grond and carry siege towers. The Grond crew, 150, and Grond is the massive battering ram in case you don't know. Catapults and siege engine, 500 crew, 10 to 12 machines used to bombard walls. Southern infantry, Haradrim, 15,000. Mumuluk war beasts, these are the massive elephants. 18 beasts with an 80 crew each, equaling 1,500 troops. That's actually a lot of dudes on top of big ass elephants. Easterling halberdiers, 7,000. Cavalry, Haradrim, 5,000. Black Numenorian officers, 250. And then Witch King Nazgul, 9. Obviously, the army of Mordor has many advantages, one being the sheer size of it in scope and scale, with any of their units greatly outnumbering the defenders of Gondor. It looks pretty bad. But if history has taught us anything, David can beat Goliath. There's also the air assets. This is a massive one. If you have these things flying around, imagine being a commander up in the air where you can see all of your troops clear as day. Pretty much no one in Gondor can touch you. As you can look, observe, okay, maybe you want to communicate, fly back down, tell your orc captains, hey, shift here, shift there, do this or that, and then fly back up. And then while the other guys are maybe just flying around terrorizing or causing harm on the city because, well, really, they have no assets to touch you in this instance. And then, of course, the big ass elephants are terrifying. Those things are like mammoths on steroids. It'd be like having a mega tank of, I guess, Middle Earth showing up on your doorstep. Terrifying. So a big part of the strategy in general has to do with defense in depth. Buying yourself enough time for reinforcements to show up and either cut off logistical supply lines or force the hands of Mordor into making a mistake and exploiting that mistake to give you the leverage on the battlefield, i.e. more Gondorian troops showing up, more Rohirrim troops showing up, and then utterly just destroying that army. A big thing about Gondor is I would think they have the premier heavy infantry as far as men go in Middle Earth, like I said before. Though it's not really shown too well in the movie. And what I mean by this is that, say, as the orcs are crossing the river at Osgiliath, there was a Gondorian lookout that was about to alert the guys, and then an orc shot an arrow at him, and that arrow went right through his breastplate of armor. But in reality, it's like there's really no bow that's going to penetrate a well-made plate armor, even if you get up to like 160 pounds, which I guarantee you that little orc was not pulling a 160-pound warbow. I have plenty of friends that can shoot a 160-pound warbow. I have seen the armor test, say from Joe Gibbs and Todd's Workshop, shooting at medieval plate, and despite how much weight Joe Gibbs can pull, his arrows were not able to penetrate that plate. So it's a big bummer. If anything, what bugs me about Peter Jackson's movie is the lack of the sheer presence that he gives the average Gondorian soldier. For instance, if we look at Boromir, without any plate armor on in Fellowship of the Ring, was absolutely stacking bodies of the Uruk-hai while he was trying to distract them, and they were all just attacking him. It took Lurtz with some scary ass looking bow, I'm sure it was a heavy pull because those Uruk-hai are jacked, to take down Boromir from a distance, and he didn't even have armor on, but yet he was stacking Uruk-hai. Of course, we have to think that Boromir is probably like the best of the best that Gondor has to offer. And if he was stacking 10s and 20s of Uruk-hai, then maybe even the average Gondorian, even on the low end of Gondorian infantry that we see, should be easily capable of schwacking like 5 regular Mordor orcs, and of course, maybe even 5 Uruk-hai, given the right formation and circumstances, right? If you get surrounded by guys and it's just your lonesome, yeah, they're gonna take you out. It's called getting flanked, and you pretty much just lose. lose. But if you have buddies with you, it should be no problem for these Gondor infantry to stack up a massive high kill count if implemented correctly. And what we see often in the movie, and with just about any movie of antiquity with like melee fighting, is that it just turns into a rabble of conflict. One of the instances has to do with Ridley Scott, and I can pretty much never forgive him for his historical depictions, but it has to do with the legionaries known for their strict discipline, and if they broke formation, like 10 guys kill one of their own buddies. But anyway, they are attacking the Germanic tribes. Once they make contact, it all just turns into an all-out brawl in melee, no formation. It's like, what the Ridley Scott, dude. Oh! What I'm trying to get at is that I wish in the movie the Gondorian soldiers, all as a baseline, were way more badass, because the depiction of them in the movie always really left me wanting. Like, truly the only badass ones it seems like there are, like the Gondorian Rangers, and they're not really wearing armor because they're supposed to be like hit and run style troops, disrupting supply lines and or being scouts, stuff like that, right? Their job is to not necessarily engage in close combat with the enemy. Their job is to hit the enemy in the flanks when the heavy infantry is locking those guys into place. That's a big complaint that I have. Now, another thing is the size of the Mordor orc. Really, they are all as a baseline relatively small, easily sub 6 foot, easily sub 5'5". They are not as big in stature. Now, there are the Mordor Orcai, which are a bit more imposing in stature, typically ranging from like 180 to 200, 220. That's a big person that you had to fight a bunch of. That's a respectable weight. Anything below 200 may be borderline victim weight. If you're under 200, fellas, you gotta go on the bulk.
If you weigh less than 200 pounds right now, I'm mandating that you start a bulk.
So though Mordor may have like 80,000 of these particular style of troops, yeah, these guys are able to hack them down all day. That being said, there are still other factors that will come into this. So in the movie, it seems like Gondor has been taking on the troops and powers of Mordor for a bit now. In the Fellowship of the Ring, there is Boromir being desperate to take the ring back to Gondor and use it as a weapon, and it was part of his whole character arc, and I will have zero negative Boromir slander because he is a hero of Gondor and he is a better man than you or I. Minas Tirith, and yet again, Minas Tirith in the movie versus what Tolkien depicts in his books, very different, but we're gonna stick with the movie representation. For an example, in the books, there's a whole different outer wall. There's the wall that Minas Tirith had that's made out of the same material that the Tower of Isengard's made out of. There's a whole bunch of fields and crops and even villages outside of Minas Tirith, because when we look at the movie, there's just a massive grass field outside of Minas Tirith, and it's like, how does that desert of grass support a massive city of people? But that's because it doesn't, and there's zero defenses to slow any sort of orc army down. There is a whole different depiction. This whole conflict has been going on for a bit, and Mordor is pushing at Gondor on all these different fronts. But the leadership in the movie world should have recognized the need to bolster the defenses around Minas Tirith. You really just have this flat grassland that seems idyllic for an army to form up outside of your city with and get organized and then assault your city. What they should have been doing is building up the trenches, building up a whole bunch of defensive networks, and even inside of the city and outside the city to really slow down the orc armies if and when, because they're probably thinking that they will show up.
But we have the White Wizard. That's got to count for something.
In the movie, the leadership of Gondor is very bad. Unlike the books, Denethor is probably Gondor's biggest enemy, is what it seems like. A real lack of leadership, a real lack of foresight, a lot of character flaws. There's a symbology of him being a glutton for life kind of thing. It really does a poor job of preparing movie Minas Tirith for the siege that is to come, or more so the attack, not necessarily a siege, really even. Faramir should have recognized his father's lack of ability to lead. And this would be a really tough thing to quantify, because I think Faramir is a man of honor. He's trying to really respect his father's wishes and carry out the best that he can, but he should have had the clarity to realize, hey, my dad is doing such a poor job leadership that I need to take over. It would have been like Spears going up to Lieutenant Dyke and being like, I'm taking over. That's what he should have done. He should have told the Gondorian guard, been like, hey, I'm taking over, throw this dude in like the brig or something. I'm running the show. And then started building up the defenses around Gondor, talking multiple trench lines, really denying access to that gate so you can't roll up a massive ram in front of it willy-nilly. I was watching this video back and I totally realized that I forgot to even talk about the pointless cavalry charge by Denethor against Osgiliath. Okay, first off, this just makes me mad. Like, I mean, that's like another clear-cut example of like, hey, my dad's off his rocker. I'm not doing a cavalry charge with a handful of knights on a city. Cavalry charges themselves are already dangerous on densely packed formations of infantry. It's a whole nother ballgame to attack a stone city. Like, what are you gonna do? Roll up and all the orc archers are gonna look down at you and just shoot their bows and kill you? It's like, what are you doing? Like, at that point, I'd be like, okay, for sure, I am just gonna like smother my dad with a pillow or something. Like, that's just out of this world. Murder. When I'm on the green screen, I feel like I got all this power. I can't stress enough how much longer the assault would have taken the armies of Mordor to enact in the movie if there was even the most basic level of trench. Because with those siege towers in the movie, when you're looking at those things, they are really impractical. I mean, siege towers, you gotta think about, a lot can go wrong with those old style wheels. Not a lot of clearance, there's not like a suspension on those things. One big dip, and if they're all loaded up, up armored, heavily, top heavy, if they hit the wrong little divot, that whole thing's gonna topple over. And that's like in ideal conditions, you're not getting shot at by the trebuchets inside of Gondor. So ideally, while all the other armies are out there defending Gondor's borders, Minas Tirith garrison is around the clock, yet again, like I've said in many other videos, preparing the defenses. You're gonna get the whiteboard. So here is my top-down perspective of my poorly drawn Minas Tirith. As a structure, Minas Tirith is perhaps one of the finest structures in Middle-earth. The orcs want to get in, but I say no thank you. The fine Gondorians don't want no orcs in Minas Tirith. You have to go. You can't come in. No thank you. Bye-bye. You're fired. As a defensive structure, Minas Tirith is very intimidating. You don't just have one wall, you have like 5 walls that you have to clear, and they're all tiered going up, and there's many choke points and fatal funnels. The entire city itself is like one giant fatal funnel even when you do get in. So if I was a guy in Gondor, some average Gondorian soldier, I'd be like, well, yeah, they outnumber us a lot, but even if they get in, I know that we have plenty of fatal funnels to disrupt these guys with. The only thing I'd be really worried about would be the massive trolls. They're massive heavy infantry, like just, terrifyingly strong, and then their air assets. Now you may be wondering, hey, what about those giant elephants? Buddy, how's a giant elephant gonna get in here? Even if it did, we'll kill that thing. The Gondorian Rangers were able to take out those elephants when they ambushed them. Why am I worried about these elephants getting inside a city? So I'm feeling pretty good about my chances. And that's one reason I was excited, is that the defensive potential here is rather great. We know as a leadership, Mordor is gonna kind of get here one way or another. We're just trying to buy time to then build up our defenses. And this is where I'm taking over. We're done going over the circumstances, say in Peter Jackson's movie. Now we're gonna add in Bureauphil's desires to see a much more successful siege, now with all the factors in play that we know. With the time allotted to us, we're gonna dig a trench, right? We're gonna dig a trench all the way around the city. That's way too wide for this first trench. Spoiler, there's gonna be a lot of trenches. And don't let my poor drawing fool you. So trench 1, we got trench 1 dug, and then we have trench 2 for our movie Fortress. You know what? We're gonna have 3 trenches. We're gonna dig as many trenches as time will allow us, right? Pretty much digging up the earth outside of Minas Tirith, the grassland that it is, to really obstruct an easy approach to Minas Tirith. Now, could this bite us in the ass once the Rohirrim cavalry, being 6,000 strong, show up? Potentially, because say the trenches that we dug to slow them down can now be used against the Rohirrim as a defensive measure so that army could then kind of counter siege or counter defend itself. That could potentially bite us in the ass, but we may get there. And then another big thing would just be any sort of obstruction inside the trenches, sharpened spikes, anything that really to slow down the movement to get up to Minas Tirith. and repeat for all other trenches. This is the time allows thing. A big thing I'd want to do is make some kind of drawbridge, trench, really disrupt the earth in front of the gate. So not only will we have a massive layer of outer trenches, but we would have a layer of inner trenches within that outer trench in front of the gatehouse. This is for, say, when we send out our scouts to look at the army of Mordor, and they would have to be very cognizant. It would be a very dangerous job because of the fast-moving air assets that are those Nazgul flying around. Because say we could send out all the scouts we want, but if they're getting taken out by the Nazgul, how are we going to get that info to know that they have a massive giant battering ram? So that is a tricky little thing to kind of think about. That's a really massive asset that they have. Fast-moving, pretty much dragons that can fly down and take out your scouts. Suboptimal. Kind of looks like a menorah. These trenches themselves and any disruption of the ground will pay massive dividends when that orc army shows up. Sure, they could in theory lay siege, but what they really do in the movie is they leave Mordor and they show up and they don't really siege the city. They assault it off the rip. There's a whole bunch of logistical questions that go into this because you have an army of 200,000 that you have to feed. And in theory, these soldiers could carry like 10 days of food, but they have to do all these marching in miles, but they have to stay together when they're marching in miles, and how they move around the battlefield or in the space of Middle Earth. You know, they may be moving as one column or they may be moving as multiple columns. So there's a lot of that, but kind of boil it down so we don't get too in the weeds there. In the movie, they really don't lay siege in the traditional sense to Minas Tirith, right? They don't set up camp. They don't dig trenches themselves to set up a defensive perimeter from sallies from the city. They show up and they instantly assault the city. And there could be some logistical question in there because in the movie, when we get that massive top-down shot, we don't really see any sort of baggage train coming from Osgiliath, you know, where they took the city. We don't really see any sort of like camping or setups or, you know, just any sort of living standards to show that they're gonna start besieging. They show up, they get into a massive formation that technically doesn't make that much sense, but it looks scary. They instantly assault. And they have a clear pathway straight to the city walls, no obstructions. And if there was any semblance of a trench that would have stopped or slowed down that assault, it would have bought them a massive amount of time. Those simple trenches that the people in Minas Tirith could have built would have gone a long way for allowing your reinforcements to show up. Because if those siege towers do show up, they now have to create a path to the walls. If that battering ram shows up, they now have to create a path to the gate, all while coming under fire from the assets in Gondor. In Gondor, I believe there's like 4 to 6 trebuchets, and the trebuchets themselves don't make that much sense given their placement, because a trebuchet has like an arcing level of fire, right? It doesn't need a direct line of sight. You can keep them more hidden, which would be more beneficial inside the city to get them much more longevity, so they're not at risk of, saying, getting messed with by the Nazgul or getting return fire from the enemy catapults. And all while that's going on, say they're trying to build this stuff up or where they're trying to attack, artillery inside of Minas Tirith can be targeting those areas that they want. Like say one day, it's like, hey, all trebuchets are going to target the far left, siege tower or camp or whatever they're working on. And that's a whole other thing in the movie is the ammunition they're using doesn't make a lot of sense. Like I have some questions. There's that very infamous scene where they launch a piece of the city back out at the army, but it's this massive piece of wall. In my head, I was thinking, how do they even load that thing up into the trebuchet? Because a trebuchet is a counterweight. That thing looks way heavier than what the counterweight would have been. Like you're talking thousands and thousands of pounds, when in reality, like the heaviest, historically trebuchet weight could have been anywhere from like 300 to 500 pounds. And that would have been a massive weight to send out there. So ideally, what there should have been was some sort of flammable liquid that they would have been launching out to the armies of Mordor that are assaulting. That way you're creating these massive pockets of fire, and that in itself is an obstacle that is created because you can't, unless you're like, I guess, Jesus, you can't really walk through fire, so you would just get burned, and now you have to work around that, and then you're offering the potential to be lighting enemy siege equipment on fire itself. That would also pay massive dividends, not just sending out pieces of your own city that you can't physically possibly load up into a trebuchet, you can also actually now start sending real ordnance out. Now, another thing they should have done is lean into anti-air assets, not just for the sense of air, but for the other very powerful entities in the army. Anti-air, anti-troll, hell, even anti-elephant. If those elephants get close enough, they can pretty much have a scorpion that could launch spears much faster at these large entities, giving them much more flexibility. They should have been creating these things like non-stop to have around the city and making them mobile. Think like when you play Rome 2 Total War, how you have the scorpion, you can just send this massive bolt at whatever you need it to. You'd be having guys looking out for the Nazgul coming around. Oh, the Nazgul get close, watch this. And you start sending a bunch of scorpion bolts up at the Nazgul. That's gonna really be a big morale booster, knowing they don't have free reign in your airspace. They can't get that close, otherwise they're gonna catch a bolt from one of your scorpions. And then on top of that, say if the trolls do get in, yeah, there may be trolls inside the walls, but they're down low. Your scorpions are up high. They just turn around, shift fire, start hitting these massive trolls with these scorpion bolts. That's pretty devastating. They start catching multiple scorpion bolts. They're gonna go down pretty quick. And then now you have the benefit of a roadblock that those orcs getting into the city now have to work around. Now we have these outer defenses, and they're kind of hastily put together, right? We don't have the manpower to really say, okay, now on this outer trench, let's build a big wooden wall. I'm all for it, and I'm all down for it, but that's a big time thing. Like, I'm all for building a whole bunch of wooden palisades on the outside of each of these trench systems. I'm down for it. Any sort of thing inside of there too that would slow down any sort of advancement, caltrops, spikes, pits that orcs could fall into, any sort of MacGyverism you want to have, I'm all down for it, but we're working on the constraint of time. How much time do we have? Well, if we have a bunch of time, I say we do it all. If we have, the bare minimum, we got to dig trenches, and that's all you're going to get. Now we could look at the inside of Minas Tirith, right? Minas Tirith, as far as defensive structures go, would be an absolute of a fortress to try and crack, because not only does it have multiple walls on the inside, it has multiple walls going up with a massive amount of choke points. Like, you have this giant rock protruding from the mountains. If you look at the pictures of Minas Tirith, there's like all these little archways underneath there that are these just beautiful fatal funnel choke points. And then so say if an orc army got in, say even breached that first layer, and now it's working into the second layer. Say this is a gatehouse, right? So say the orcs breach the first level.
To the second level!
Say with their battering rams, they manage to breach another level, okay, for example, and then they get to that point inside the city where there's the first fatal funnel. So that first fatal funnel, all these troops are starting to stack, and you have your Gondor heavy infantry, and the Gondor spearmen kind of remind me of Roman triarii. I think that's how you say it. I'm sorry if I butchered it. Heavily armored, big shields, spears, not necessarily pikes, but they would be a pretty formidable force in a choke point, because you could really cycle those guys out, keep them fresh, and all where they're holding a choke point, and they would already have barricades all inside the city, so at every point they are getting slowed down as they try and advance through. It's like really using their numbers against them. They would essentially have to have a whole bunch of secondary line equipment to even get a chance once they get in. What I mean by that is, okay, so you have your siege towers. Your siege towers are only up to getting you to the first wall. So now the orcs would have to be building ladders too. That's all going to take time, and we'll get there, but just for the sake of, say they don't have any of that, once they get in the city, they're just pretty much an easy target. If they're trying to break through and they're all standing around, they're gonna be getting peppered non-stop by anything and everything. Arrows, hot liquids, rocks being thrown from above. Like, say at this first checkpoint, they're right below that giant mountainous stone piece that protrudes from the mountains. Dudes on top could just be launching rocks, and then say, oh, they're worried about the Nazgul, but there's a bunch of scorpions up there defending them. They don't have to be as worried, and they can just constantly throw rocks down on the orcs. Okay, say they get pushed back, and it's like rinse and repeat as you make a slow withdrawal defense in depth. With the Gondorians, you have your skirmisher Gondorian ranger types, and then you have your Gondor archers, which are a bit more up armored, and those guys would probably be considered like the, elite heavy infantry archers of Middle Earth, but maybe not as good as the elven archers, but still pretty quality. This is a totally different side tangent, but if you look at their bows in the movie for the Gondorians at Minas Tirith, they're all pretty thin bows, when in reality those war bows are pretty stout. One thing I was thinking about would be equipping, say, your militia levies, your male citizens that aren't necessarily like the prime fighting age with crossbows. I think Tolkien didn't like crossbows because it represented like too much industrialization. That being said, in my mind, the stakes are so great with the wiping out of mankind by these orcs, I'll be willing to forego that. Just given the nature of warfare, it's like, I don't like the idea of drones blowing me up, but if that was what warfare would become, it's like, I'd also want to use drones to blow up my enemy. So, I don't know, it always kind of bugged me. You don't want to be on the back foot, so you should also probably implement this technology to use it against them, because clearly it's effective for a reason. And that being said, there's a whole crossbow versus longbow debate. It's like, you know, crossbows have their strengths, longbows have their strengths. The big difference being the skill of the archer for the longbows, or say the ease of use with the crossbow. And that's why I would run up my militia guys using the crossbow. My God, I'm working up a sweat doing this. That's how you know the video is going to be good. I have a really hard time thinking if they employed better strategies that they would make it past the second level. Like, I could see them getting into the first level, because that first wall, you know, say you build up all the things to push your siege towers to, yeah, you get in. Once you do, but if you don't have the proper equipment to get into that second level with ladders and say the third, because it just keeps getting kind of steeper and steeper, then I would really see Mordor getting bogged down on that second level. And if there's all the other things that you have access to for defense to keep the air assets off you, and then they can't really use the elephants inside the city, you're taking out the trolls with scorpions. Anytime they try and bring up a siege hammer, it just gets absolutely obliterated by archers or people throwing rocks at it. Eventually, you're going to start building up so many bodies that itself starts to act like a barricade. So now the orcs have to try and clear their own dead out of the way to have a free range of motion in the city to bring more stuff up. You're just going to bog them down, and it's going to give you that much more time. Okay, now the whole reason that we want to add to these defenses is to buy ourselves as much time as possible, because we have reinforcements showing up. The beacons were lit. We did our due diligence. Unlike in the movie, we have the idea that more Gondorians will show up, or the Rohirrim will show up, and that will greatly help alleviate the siege. The armies of Mordor roll out, and they instantly assault the city. We don't see the logistics, because maybe the Witch King is thinking, okay, I'm gonna roll out this army and instantly strike at Minas Tirith, because I know I don't have the logistics to back up a prolonged siege at this time. And that's kind of my guess, is that he has this overwhelming force, and he's thinking, obviously, if I don't have logistics, let's just take this fortress and I'll replenish anything I find in there. We can eat the citizens, eat the bodies, eat whatever else we find, and then we can go and start harassing the rest of Gondor and or pillaging and destroying it. That's why it sparks such an instantaneous assault on the city, because otherwise, why would that massive army, 200,000 strong, need to instantly assault? I'm sure there's some reason that you guys have, but in my mind, it's like you could probably even leave a force of 30 to 40,000 orcs, lay siege to that city, locking those 10,000 troops in there, and I would hope that the Gondorians sent all the women and children out long before that orc army showed up, but in the movie they didn't. You see a lot of civilians in there, which sucks. The true casualties of warfare. Anyway, I would send those civilians further into Gondor, and this would be like the place where you want to try and stop this orc army at. But in my mind, if I was the Witch King or the leader of this army, it would be like, yeah, why don't I just lock these people into place and starve them out, right? You have a 10,000 strong garrison, you just leave a fraction of your army there, and you still have this massive army to go and destroy the rest of Middle Earth with. The logistics there are non-existent for the Witch King, so that's what prompts the instantaneous assault. That being said, if there are the defensive measures in play, he can't do an instantaneous assault unless he has ladders, which then he could like do an escalade, but it's that much more dangerous and way less intimidating than trying to use your massive battering ram indoor siege towers. If you're a Gondor guy, you just stand at the top of the wall, and as the orcs come up, you just go bonk, bonk. The only thing they can really do is pretty much shoot arrows at you and try and suppress you, or use our catapults to try and suppress you, which is another thing. Those orc catapults look terrible, and probably shouldn't have the range and maybe power that they do, but whatever. Okay, so we have all of this defense in depth set up. The orcs see this, they show up, they do not have the logistical capability to have themselves a prolonged siege, because they didn't think that they were going to have to do all this extra building once they got to Minas Tirith. There could be the other flip side where they were expecting it, because maybe they saw the Gondorians putting all this extra stuff up, so they thought, okay, well, we better have all the logistics in place. It kind of could go either way. So in this situation, say they don't have the logistics, they're pretty much cooked, right? If they thought they were going to have an easy approach to Gondor, just wheel up the siege towers, wheel up the ram, and then you're in because you have massive numbers, that's now kind of out the window, because it's going to take days to properly properly build all of the structure you need to have a nice level surface to roll everything up to so nothing tips over or falls over. And while that's going on, you're getting just berated by all the missile assets that Minas Tirith has. On the flip side, if they did have the scouting, or maybe the Nazgul saw all the defenses and said, hey, we have to have this logistical supply train, then there's a better chance, right? So then they would show up, then they would set up a siege camp, they would start assembling everything with the idea that, hey, we're sitting in for a siege, but the issue is the Rohirrim are gonna show up. Now the Rohirrim show up either way, and of course the army of the ghosts show up and wreck everybody, but we'll get there. The Rohirrim are gonna show up 6,000 strong. That's my Rohirrim. Based off the timeline that we see in the movie, where it's like a couple days of fighting and then the orcs get in. Added defenses we have in our video in this scenario would slow down the orcs enough to where they would never have gotten into Minas Tirith at all, because they have to do all this prep work now to even approach the wall.
This is a war that should have never started. If I were president, it would never have started.
You see how important trenches are, kids? You see when things, every move, any time you see like a battle in Hollywood now, just think, damn, dude, where's your guys' trenches? Where are they? Who would have thunk digging a pit was so meta? Maybe that's why they leave it out of movies, is because they're like, oh shit, it's gonna ruin my timeline for writing. Yeah, so I don't think they're even getting into the city within the timeline of the movie where the Rohirrim show up. All right, here's a dealio. So the Rohirrim show up, they're 6,000 strong, 6,000 of the elite cavalry of Middle-earth. How do we implement them in the best way possible? The army of the orcs are outside of the city, either with good logistics in the scenario or without good logistics. Say there's a massive camp, 200,000 orcs outside of the city walls, getting ready, gearing up, doing all this work, and then the Rohirrim show up. Another thing in the movie is interesting enough, when you see the army of the orcs, they're all in like this massive infantry formations, mainly just a massive square almost with a few different formations, but it's like reasonably that's not the most effective formation, because it's like, how do you maneuver all these massive squares around cohesively? Like, I would have given the orcs mad props if they built themselves like a big tower to try and observe the battlefield from, but that could be kind of redundant if you have these flying dragons around, so whatever. But it'd still be nice to have, you know, it's like they could fly down, fly next to the tower and be like, attack here. I don't know, like kind of Nazgul talk. All right, so we have to assume the orcs show up and they start to settle in for the siege camp, right? And then the Rohirrim show up. The orcs can't even really assault yet, so they can't get in, so they have to set up camp. So if we are Theoden, how do we go about disrupting this siege? Well, chances are the orcs are gonna have logistics if they knew this was getting built. So they got their camp, and in this scenario, all the formation, they're all just camping out, waiting to assault, maybe preparing their own defensive positions, yada, yada, yada. So we got our camp with our logistical baggage supply train, moving stuff from Mordor to supply the army. To me, the obvious answer is to take 3,000 of that cavalry and just absolutely jack up that supply train. Absolutely give them zero chance of resupply. Now, big risk here is the other assets out there, because there are other cavalry, there are those giant elephant things. It's not just infantry you have to worry about, because of the cavalry, the Rohirrim, yeah, they can outride the infantry, but they can't outride the other cavalry. Boom, I appeared. Another thing I realized while watching back this video is that I never discussed this, and that was in the Peter Jackson's movie, the lack of the Haradrim cavalry at the Battle of Pelennor Fields. You really don't see them. It's really just the Mamluk riders that show up, of course, which the Rohirrim then have to deal with. So in this instance, while making this video, I totally did not account for any of that cavalry, even though it was listed earlier in the troop roster of the video. This may irk some of you. Some of you may have not cared by now, or you are checked out completely. There will be a test at the end of the video. Not really, I'm not doing a test, I'm not a teacher. I think they could outride the elephants and get away from them, because I honestly think in the movie, when King Theoden saw those elephants, he should have been like, you know what? We're gonna pull off real quick. We're gonna get inside the walls and go attack the orcs inside of Minas Tirith and get the hell away from those elephants. I think doing a charge on those massive elephants that King Theoden did after the initial breaking of the orc army when he showed up in the movie, he should have been like, I'm gonna peel off real quick and not try and get my guys killed by these things, because it's like, as a horse rider, unless unless you ride around them and stay away from their physical reach. Yeah, you could probably get, peppered by the guys on top, but at least you can start shooting at them with your horse archers. That would be a better move. In the movie, you don't really see the Haradrim cavalry at all. Now, if that's the case, then there's no other mounted troops that we have to worry about in particular to this scenario. It's just the massive elephant showing up. So that's kind of like a nice thing for us. So really, you kind of got carte blanche to just absolutely disrupt their supply lines if they get those established. Once you disrupt those supply lines with that 3,000 force, maybe you don't even need 3,000 guys to really disrupt that orc supply. Maybe you only need like 1,000 cavalry riders. Maybe you only need 500. And the rest are just on security, keeping that army contained so where they can't sally out and attack you. And now they're surrounded and those orcs are gonna start to panic a little bit. Honestly, in my mind, once you do that, you've pretty much won the battle and that army has to pack up and go home. All right, this is supposed to be the elephant line that show up in the battle in the movie. If they have that cavalry cut off the logistical supply line, yeah, the army is pretty much cooked. They can't sustain themselves for a prolonged siege, so they either have to commit to a rapid assault, starve themselves out, which they could kind of get cannibalistic in the camp. It's not unknown for the orcs to do that. So that could be an option, really, where it's like you preserve your most elite infantry and literally use the worst infantry to fuel, your elite guys if you're the orcs. That way you can stay put and then finish this siege through. Pretty much like if anybody that's building up fortifications, any orc I should say, that's building up fortifications, doing the grunt manual labor work, say they get killed by something, say an explosive hawk comes out and cooks, a dozen orcs, I guess that's food for your best fighting orcs to keep them sustained, which is a pretty gnarly example. And I kind of like that. I'm happy I thought of that on the spot. So that's kind of an interesting X factor advantage that an orc army could have. It's like, well, in theory, yeah, we may need these logistical supply chains if you want to keep as many guys alive as possible, but in a pinch, you could just cannibalize the worst of your army to feed the best of your army and then still stay in the field. So we could keep that going. If that's the case and they stay, they start cannibalizing themselves. The bottom tier orcs are dying, they're getting killed. They're either just outright being killed on the spot for food as the orcs start to get hungrier and hungrier. Yeah, then there could be the potential where they build up and start getting into close to where they can start implementing their siege works. Because I have a hard time thinking, they deploy this army, they run out of food, now they're gonna go back to Mordor to restock and then say, re-prepare for another assault. Well, okay, so say they're staying there. They're going to have to set up some sort of defensive network that makes sure they just don't get outright flanked. They could even potentially dig their own trenches so they don't have to worry about the Rohirrim just outright breaking through, so that could be a possibility. It really would slow down any just massive cavalry assault if that was the case. And then the Rohirrim still have to contend with the massive elephants. So how do we handle those guys? So say, based off the movie, the orc army has 0 cavalry assets. They only have the giant elephants. Well, you got 6,000 cream of the crop riders versus 18 elephants. Pretty much what I would do is just horse archer them to death. You have 1,500 potential mounted archers on top of these elephants, but after a while they're gonna get peppered into oblivion by these skillful master horse archers that are the Rohirrim. Maybe not every one of the Rohirrim is gonna be a horse archer, of course. Say they may not be a designated horse archer, but they probably know how to be a horse archer. A lot of little nuances that go into it. Anyway, everybody's got to eat, and the elephants themselves also have to eat. Like, I don't know what they can get away with eating, or if even the Mamluk riders have the logistics to feed them, or if they were expecting the reinforcements from the river to show up, but that's a hard thing to say. I would assume a lot of this hinged on the river logistics, and it's kind of like a deleted scene in the movie where they take over the barges or the boats, and then they roll up, and a whole army of the dead comes off. It plays out different yet again in the book, but this is all movie. Okay, so we send a detachment of cavalry to go jack up the supply line over here, and while that's going on, the Mamluk realize that they don't want the logistical supply train to get cut off, so they probably go to engage, and then the rest of the force would probably come to engage these guys. But I think the best course of action would pretty much be to horse archer them to death. Honestly, I really don't see the orc army trying to chase down the Rohirrim. They could try and face them and try and keep pushing them further back and back, but the Rohirrim could just keep going and intercepting the logistical supply train until, say, they've just straight up built up a fort from their siege camp all the way to Osgiliath, which would have to be a massive fort. It's not impossible, you know, like a line of defense for a baggage train, but I think that would take so much time that the army would probably consume itself before they were lethal enough to fight. That's really the only way I could see. And honestly, you have a 200,000 strong army. You know, guys can go for a bit without eating, but if the orcs are getting hungry, you know, they're not necessarily hypothetical, right? If they're trying to build this massive, secure pipeline to Osgiliath, what are they doing? They're stretching themselves super thin. They're doing manual labor if they are building. If they're just doing security, they're stretching themselves thin and taking themselves away from the structure itself. And then that gives the Gondorians inside a chance to sally out, start fighting, destroying whatever the progress they made, and or reinforcements showing up. Honestly, I think with just a little bit better of foresight, we have a really good chance of just stopping any attempt that they have here. And of course, we have very much a nerdy armchair general perspective here. In the movie, there is like the, the Ex Machina, where a ghost army shows up and just kills everybody. It just saves the day. The good guys win in that instance. To me, it kind of takes away from the coolness where you have this like unkillable ghost army that shows up. And I know like how maybe it could be portrayed different, but anyway, I think this is a much better plan. I think it could fold out more interesting. Now, granted, this itself would be just undoable for a movie, maybe for a TV episode, and it could be done a lot better with a lot more foresight. I'm just one dude. This is like a spitball at what I think it would look like and or play out and could be better, and I'm sure you guys have your own thoughts and opinions too. I think I covered everything I wanted to cover about this particular battle. That being said, I don't want you to think that I dislike the portrayal that Peter Jackson did of the Battle of Minas Tirith, because I think it was very cool. I enjoyed it thoroughly, but there are things in my mind that I thought if it was me leading it, I would have implemented to give my city that much more of a better chance at holding off the armies of darkness. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's like a who cares kind of thing. Me, technically I do. Yet again, to me, this kind of video is mainly just catharsis to talk about. Chances are, if you do subscribe, you are a fan of this kind of content in some way, shape, or form. And truly, gentlemen, I have nothing else for you. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you on the flip. We have super technology. We have a thing called Gandalf the White, really nice wizard.